Good evening, everybody. My name is Sophie Byrne. I'm a member of the SAMAG committee, and it's really wonderful to have you with us for tonight's conversation. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we are joining from tonight. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and would like to thank Gadigal elders for their custodianship of land, country, and culture. SAMAG is thrilled to be partnering with Accessible Arts to present this conversation tonight with our excellent panellists, Morwenna Collett, Dan Graham, Eugenie Lee, and Jackie Leach Scully to discuss innovating art through disability. I'll very shortly pass over to the CEO of Accessible Arts, Liz Martin, to start the event. I just wanted to quickly highlight that SAMAG offers an annual program of events to share practical, inspiring, and innovative ideas to grow an inclusive and resilient art sector. And we have a couple of great events coming up in October on reopening and what the recently released roadmap means for our sector, facilitated by Tandy Palmer-Williams, plus a thought leadership event in November. So it's a very good time to join SAMAG if you haven't already. Now I'd like to welcome Liz Martin, CEO of Accessible Arts, to begin tonight's session. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, everyone, and welcome to this evening's conversation. If you haven't heard of Accessible Arts, we are the peak arts and disability organisation across New South Wales. We advance the rights of and opportunities for people with disability or who are deaf to develop and sustain professional careers in the arts and have equitable access to arts and culture. We are absolutely delighted to co-present this conversation alongside SAMAG. And in terms of speakers, I can honestly and personally say that each of these speakers is an absolute delight. I've had the most fascinating conversations with all four of them. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome Eugenie Lee, Jackie Leach Scully, and Morwenna Collett, alongside Dan Graham, to lead us through a conversation, Innovating Art Through Disability.
Thank you so much, Liz, and Sophie as well, and Sasha from SAMAG and Accessible Arts for bringing us together this evening to have a conversation with you all. Hello, Jackie, Eugenie, Dan, great to see you here and really looking forward to getting into all sorts of things tonight as we talk about our topic, Innovating Through Art and Disability. And why this topic, I suppose? Well, certainly I feel that artists with disability are making some of the most exciting, experimental, risk-taking, cutting-edge, innovative work on the planet. It's work that I love. It's made by artists who represent 20% of our population. 1 in 5 Australians live with disability. However, we know that only 9% of our professional artists with disability in Australia identify as artists with disability. And sadly, those artists with disability only earn 42% less of what artists without disability earn. So there's definitely some roadblocks and some barriers, which I'm sure we'll get into tonight. But, you know, to kind of come back to our premise, we're talking about this area because it's exciting. Artists with disability are talented. They're elevating our collective experience of art and transforming how we understand the world. And they've got some really innovative ways of working as both artists, and we're finding innovative ways to include audiences with disability in the arts as well. So what we're going to do is I'll introduce our 3 panelists this evening, and I'll do them one by one, and I'll then ask for each of you to speak for a couple of minutes about your practice, what you'd like to share with us around this topic, and then we'll get into the conversation part of this evening. As we're going through, as you're watching along at home, if you'd like to ask any questions of any of our speakers tonight, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A box in the chat, and we'll weave those into the conversation as they come up. So don't be shy. Questions from the audience are more than welcome. Okay, so let's begin with Jackie, if that's okay. So Jackie Leach Scully is Professor of Bioethics and Director of something called the Disability Innovation Institute at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. And she's a very proud and strong disability activist as well. Over the years, Jackie's research has looked at people with disability in medicine and healthcare, including some pretty controversial topics such as prenatal genetic selection, assistive technologies, and access to care in health emergencies. Jackie is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, of the Royal Society of Arts, and of the Hastings Centre in New York. In 2020, she was named as one of Australia's outstanding 50 LGBTQIA+ leaders by Deloitte Australia. Jackie, I'd love to hand over to you and hear a little bit about you and your work. And you're just on mute at the moment.
I know, that was a really good start to the evening. Thank you. Okay, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm, as you said, I'm a bioethicist, Professor of Bioethics at UNSW, and I'm also Director of the Disability Innovation Institute there. And I think, as you mentioned, in my career, I've worked on a lot of controversial topics, particularly in the disability space. I don't think many disability activists feel very warmly sometimes towards bioethics as a field because it's so strongly associated historically with some pretty controversial opinions and sometimes some very hostile to disability opinions. So in my work though, I do try to work against that and make it a space in which people can ask some serious questions about what we mean by disability, what we mean by difference and divergence and so on, about accommodation, about acceptance, all those sorts of topics. But I've also always been very interested in the arts, and despite the fact that I've been profoundly deaf since childhood, I lost my hearing with meningitis when I was a small child. I've been married for 35 years to a professional musician, a classical musician. So we have some very interesting discussions about sound and music and arts practice in that area. And at one point, my partner was a what we call a Madame la Directrice, which is basically the principal of a musical conservatoire in Switzerland. And that had a strong connection with the local art college as well. So there was a lot of interaction between musical practice and visual arts and performance arts as well in that college. So again, I was drawn into that world. I have to say, I'm not a practicing artist, except for about 20 minutes a couple of times a week when I haul out my saxophone and I play really, really badly. I think I play badly not because I'm deaf, but because I don't practice enough. But we can talk about that more later. I'm just really interested to hear about other people's views and work and practice in this conversation.
And Jackie, I have to ask, is saxophone been a long hobby or was it a COVID take-up?
It's a longer hobby. When I first got together with my partner, I was being defensive about being involved in music. I'm happy to talk more about that later on. And she said to me, okay, when you're 40, I'm going to get you a saxophone. And I said, yeah, sure, okay. And on my 40th birthday, I came out of the bedroom and there in the hall was this big saxophone shaped package. And I thought, okay, got to do it now. And so I have since then, and I haven't progressed very much.
Amazing. Look, there's so much to unpack in that, and I'm really interested in music and deafness and assistive technologies, and there's lots of intersecting parts I think that your work covers, and yeah, will be great to have as part of the conversation. Let's move on to Eugenie next. So Eugenie Lee is a Sydney-based Korean-Australian interdisciplinary artist with a conceptual focus on her lived experience with persistent pain. Experimentation and collaboration with pain scientists and researchers who investigate ways in which technologies can assist in pain research are an important conceptual underpinning for Eugenie's interdisciplinary art practice, which includes participatory performances using technologies, installations, sculptures, and paintings. By appropriating the latest scientific concepts and lab materials, including VR and electronics, and reconfiguring them for non-therapeutic uses, Eugenie creates holistic pain experiences as creative outcomes. She works closely with researchers and follows their protocols and ethics, notwithstanding using their techniques in ways they were probably not originally designed for. So Eugenie, there is a lot in that, and I've certainly read about your work, but I haven't had the chance to experience it firsthand yet. And goodness me, it sounds great and terrifying at the same time. So we'd love to hear from you now a little bit about your work.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. So my practice, so a lot of people ask me, what do you do as an artist? Do you do painting or sculpture? And I said, no, I actually give pain to people for a living. So if I actually expand that, I am an experimental artist using interactive performance installation to create artworks about persistent pain, because I've been living with persistent pain for nearly 3 decades. So the artworks are informed by not only by my lived experience, but also by pain science and other people's lived experiences as well. And I use creative technologies like virtual realities, and I hack therapeutic machines like TENS machines and things like that, and turn that into a custom-built haptic device for each participant to undergo multifaceted experience of persistent pain. So for example, I invite a participant inside a small anechoic chamber, in other words, a very small isolation chamber, and temporarily manipulate their brain using a variety of techniques whilst they're wearing virtual reality goggles and a haptic custom-built gloves to experience something similar to a neuropathic pain on their hands without involving real pain. Or sometimes they're also invited to play a simple virtual reality game whilst wearing a haptic belt around their pelvis to give them pelvic pain-like experience. So it's not a pleasant experience, but surprisingly, I've been very lucky with a lot of people queuing up to experience something quite torturous, and it still makes me wonder why. But anyway, so it takes a lot of time for me to prepare and do research, because I want to make sure that the experience can be authentic without actually creating a real pain, because I've got to pass the ethics and all that. So I spent several months or over a year to do research. And I also work with other researchers like neuroscientists, linguists who specialize in pain expression through different genders and cultures, empathy experts, psychologists, and so on, to make sure that my work is scientifically valid. The reason I focus heavily on science is because persistent pain cannot be adequately understood unless pain science and its related neuroplasticity is involved. But having said that, I also focus on disability studies like crip time and things like that to bring a different perspective. So it's not only about science and lived experience, but there's a third agenda, the social and psychological aspects as well. So I'm also very interested to hear what Jackie has to say, because like we kind of briefly talked about this before, that when it comes to human experience or disability experience, people talk about social model versus medical model. But when it specifically comes to persistent pain or chronically ill situations, we cannot deny one way or the other, because we live in this body. We have only one body to live and experience us and our surrounding. It involves a whole ecosystem, ecology, and networks. So in that sense, I would like to look both perspective, or should I say a third perspective that involves both and focus on future so nobody's left behind? Thank you.
Amazing, Eugenie. And can I ask you, I'm guessing you started out as an artist and then science kind of crept in. What was the moment where you realized that science had become a really large part of your practice as well?
That was actually surprisingly through working with neuroscientists who specialize in persistent pain. And I was lucky enough to receive art residency grants through Accessible Arts, and then consequently Australian Network for Art and Technology afterwards, to continue working with neuroscientists based on University of South Australia. And little did I know that these people turned out to be world's best, some of the best scientists. And I've never even heard of pain science before I actually Googled them. And then I just sent an email with the first person who just popped up on a Google research. But it was just a complete, almost like a freak accident / lucky. They taught me how to look at my own frustrating, unresolved experience living with pain from a neuroscientist perspective. But neuroscientists in Australia, and also some of the top neuroscientists in pain research, they are so holistic. Like, I actually kept telling them, you guys are more holistic than tree huggers, because they're looking at biopsychosocial. So bio is only part of it. We're just talking about these body, but psychosocial components that nobody ever talked about, like in my experience of living with pain, they introduced me this amazing side of it. And to be able to understand pain, you got to understand this pain science, biopsychosocial, this network of, like I mentioned before, the ecology of living experience. What was the question again?
Art and science, and when did they collide? But it sounds like it's been a really kind of natural and interesting progression, and quite fortuitous in that you stumbled across the right people at the right time. So lots to unpack and ask you about, Eugenie. Absolutely. And I'm really interested to see how all the work of all three of our panellists tonight are connected and aligned in some way. But let me introduce you to our third panellist now, Dan Graham. Dan is a young neurodiverse writer and director from Sydney. He directed the acclaimed production Sam I Am, and has directed Arthur Miller's The Crucible, Harold Pinter's A Kind of Alaska, and Hilary Bell's Wolf Lullaby, just to name a couple. Dan has had directing secondments with organisations like the Melbourne Theatre Company, Victorian Opera, the Ensemble Theatre, and Opera Australia, Bell Shakespeare, Sport for Jove, and he's been invited on a directing secondment on Neil Armfield's The Book of Everything. Dan holds a BA in theatre, specialising in directing from the University of Tasmania, and honours in performance studies from the University of Sydney. He's a proud member of the LGBTQIA+ community, and also an active advocate for arts practitioners with disability. So Dan, I thought it would be great to start to hear a little bit about your professional background and perhaps some of the work you've been doing recently.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Morwenna, and this. And I think, as we were just discussing before we all went live, I think this is a very timely, not saying there hasn't been a time before now, but a very timely time to have this discussion. I always make the statement that I don't expect everyone who was a young kid of 12 years old who was sent to acting classes to decide on a career in theatre. I'm not saying at all, disability or otherwise. But the reason why, ironically, I was sent to acting classes as a 12-year-old, and people who in this room who know me smile when I say this, it was pretty much to get me out of my shell, because I'm very much of a generation, if I can say, that people, and not some people totally do now, but didn't totally understand what neurodiversity is. I'm of a generation that literally I was either too slow, stupid, etc. Because part of my neurodiversity also incorporates mild cerebral palsy as well as dyslexia, as well as neurodiversity as a broader term. So I think that's quite funny to think that that 12-year-old who was put at the back of the classroom, literally is at front desk and telling other people what to do in a nice way, of course. I find it very interesting that I decided on a career in theatre, and it's only been, ironically, the last few years it's starting to take place what we're talking about tonight and what I'm going to point here. And that was, I didn't see myself or people with disabilities actually being shown on, let's just be blunt about it, the main stages in Australia. And that very much started in my discussion that a couple of years ago, there was a discussion, which is still happening, which is very important, the discussion on diversity. But very often, and I'm happy if people disagree with me on this statement, but there wasn't or still isn't much talk on disability. And especially when I tell people I'm a theatre director and they hear the term disability neurodiversity and say, oh, is that a hobby of yours? And I always make a joke, my $50,000 worth of ex debt, including my masters, would disagree on that statement. So the same. So it came to me that with a lot of discussion about, in terms of diversity, again, as we said, disability wasn't brought up. And with my own previous research, which included being awarded from Australian Council of Arts as well as Empire Cultural Trust, I was actually awarded in January, trying to remember with COVID, everything's all blur now, but in January of 2019, I was actually awarded a fellowship, which took me over to New York for a directing residency at Atlantic Theatre Company, which is one of the major theatre companies in New York. And people interested in theatre, I'm sure, have heard of it. David Mamet, the great playwright, started a company about 30 odd years, so it's got history to it. I was very concerned because, call it my own bias, discrimination, whatever you want to call it, I did not identify as having a disability at that stage because, as I've said to you privately, Morwenna, and I'm happy to say here, with the development which I have now with Bell Shakespeare, which hopefully will start, or not hopefully, will restart again once we all come out of COVID, which ironically is on how I see neurodiversity under the lens of Shakespeare. I actually pitched it to another theatre company, which I won't mention here, and this was someone who I met in a social setting a number of times, so they knew who I was. And the comment to me was, when I outed myself, as I said, for the second time, the comment was, oh, but you're saying it's so normal, Dan. How's that possible? Which I found very disheartening, both now as someone who identifies as being a disability arts advocate, who's the person who identifies as having a disability, as well as obviously someone in the industry. So when I was at Atlantic, the first question they asked me was, what access requirements did I have? And I half jokingly said, was it all my spelling mistakes in an email I sent, which it wasn't. And I since found out, who I'm still in contact with, which I will discuss in a moment, that's a question they ask every member of staff, from the front of house bar staff to, let's just say, the artistic director. And it was very, I want to say, heartening as well as eye-opening, that a theatre company just saw it as common policy to actually have that question. And when I made a comment that, and I have said this for organisations that I've worked with, either as a director, which I am now doing also, obviously, and when I was starting out, in terms of access needs, ironically, I very rarely take notes in rehearsals. And part of that is what I call my superpower of my neurodiversity, is that I do have a good memory, or some would say great memory, in actually remembering the whole piece, even beforehand, despite what we were discussing. And they literally were very supportive. And like, if I needed a scribe at any times, that was provided. They sometimes, if I needed a larger text on a script, that was provided, etc. And I wasn't made to feel different, if that makes sense. And that has followed me in from that research. I was awarded, again, pre-COVID, Create New South Wales Fellowship, which took me to the UK, which was specifically on access departments, which is something I would love if we have time to discuss in more detail, and how they actually work with a professional. And this is another issue that we are all saying here, and with my fellow panelists here and others taking part, the whole idea of professional artists with a disability, which I think is very important to note. And I actually met with their access departments to discuss the work they are doing with their professional artists. And I met pretty much any theatre company, and we've discussed this before, from the National Theatre in London, National Theatre in Scotland, World Court, the Globe, Old Vic, etc. And it was almost a sense of surprise that I was actually asking the questions I was asking, because it's so ingrained, and I'm only talking about the UK in this instance, that it's so ingrained in their conversation that you don't necessarily have to, you can be a disabled artist, but you are not, if it makes sense, you're not defined by that disability, if you know what I mean. So it's just how, like any artist, the best work can be created. So I came back bringing that knowledge with me, which I'm still developing and wanting interested parties to go on my journey. And I lasted 10 minutes without mentioning journey. Record, and that has taken me to now that hopefully in early January I will be getting myself back over to New York. We've actually been awarded a ISPA, which is the International Society for the Performing Arts, based in New York, where I'm to be the Australian Fellow. And what I find so heartening, forget it's Dan Graham that's been selected, in that I've been awarded that for my directing as well as my access work. So it's because I still have the discussion, let's say politely, with people that I can't divorce each from the other, because both informs obviously my identity and my creative practice.
Oh, Dan, there's so much in that. Some of the things that stood out to me in your excellent summation of your work were, and which I think are relevant for our audience tonight, are, diversity and inclusion, and making sure that disability is part of that conversation, because you're right, it can often be kind of hidden under the carpet a little bit in D&I conversations. Your ideas and kind of, thank you for sharing your experience around identity and how, disability has become a stronger part of your identity over time. And hot tip takeaway from anyone tonight, if you're not asking about people's access requirements with all of the artists that you're working with in your work, build it into your process, whether it's your ticket purchasing process, whether it's your onboarding for new staff. Do you have any access requirements is the key takeaway question, I think, that we've had so far tonight. And yeah, really interesting to hear about your work with all of those different theatre companies. And I was actually on a similar fellowship through the Churchill Trust about a month after Dan in the UK. So everyone I met with said, Dan Graham, I met with him last month. So we kind of stalked each other in the UK. It was really fun. Well, look, thank you so much for your sort of, I know 5 minutes is not at all enough to do any of your work justice. But I'd like to come back now to each of you sort of and unpack that a little bit with you individually, and then I'll ask some broad overarching questions towards the end. And again, encourage people to put questions in the chat as we go. And I can see I've got one for Eugenie already, so I'll feed that in to Eugenie. You can have a heads up for when we come to you. So Jackie, I want to get into some more around music and deafness, and perhaps some of the stereotypes that you might have come across. And also for our audience this evening, can you tell us what it's like to experience music as a deaf person, and how that works for you individually, and perhaps also if you're aware of any of the incredible assistive technologies that are out there around music and deafness as well.
Sure. And obviously there are a whole lot of stereotypes about deafness and the ability to take part in music in particular. When I lost my hearing when I was a child, just prior to that, I'd been learning the piano, starting to learn the piano. And my parents were told after I had meningitis that I ought not to have any more contact with music, because it would probably upset me too much. My failure would upset me too much. So I was pretty much shielded from it. I was excused music lessons, etc. at school. And it wasn't until I was much older that I really developed any kind of interest in music. But as I said earlier, I was very, very hesitant about it. And until obviously I met my partner, whose whole life revolves around music and sound and so on. And it quickly became clear that, like the equivalent of standing on the touchlines with a footballer as your partner, I was going to have to get involved in this in some way if this relationship's going to have any future. But it's broken a lot of those stereotypes. The stereotype of deaf people can't hear music, or they can't enjoy it, or they can't take part in it in any way, they have no appreciation of it, etc., etc. I think one of the key things that I try to get across when people ask about that is that I do know that what I hear is not what hearing people will hear of most kinds of music, let's say. But is that actually important? Because if I enjoy it and I'm not, don't have a sense of inadequacy or resentment or anything like that, which I don't, I just feel if I enjoy what I'm hearing, then that is the important thing. Particularly because all human bodies have, we have limits, and I don't mean the kind of banal thing of we're all disabled. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have certain limits. We can't hear certain frequencies. We can't see certain wavelengths and so on. So there are things that no human being will be able to hear in what a musical instrument actually produces. So I think if we can look at it in that light and say there are people like me who will be hearing something different, but potentially what I'm hearing is actually interesting. Maybe not, it might be as interesting as the original composition, but actually what I would really like to experience, and if anybody out there is involved in a project like this, I'd be very happy to learn more about it, is a piece of music which is designed to need other senses than sound per se to experience it fully. So say with the vibration being part of the performance, and not just because the music is so loud that your insides are shaking kind of thing. We've all been to rock concerts like that. But something where the tactile bit of it is an intrinsic part and a subtle part of the overall composition. So what I'm trying to say, I think, is not just with music in particular, but with other forms of art as well, to try to move from either a sense of, if only we can make this accessible to disabled people, then they will be able to see or hear or do the same sorts of things as the rest of us can. That's one important aspect of it. But another part is different people will be experiencing this in different ways, and we can all potentially learn and enjoy and understand something different from it than just the standard mode of experience, if you want to call it that.
I think that's so interesting in terms of just how we think about access and inclusion in general. It's not trying to sort of bring something up to a certain bar that we're trying to meet in terms of matching that experience. But you're absolutely right in that there's more than one way to experience art. We know that, and there's more than one way to have experience of so many things. So it's not thinking that things have to be done in a certain way and a one size fits all approach. So that's super interesting. And before we get on to tech, Jenny's got a question here in the Q&A. It would be great to ask you if you don't mind, but she's wondering if you can feel the impact or the emotion of music, Jackie.
You mean, do I personally perceive the impact or emotion of music? Yeah, sure. I mean, there's sad music, I cry. There's uplifting music, I feel uplifted. I have to say that because I came to music late, my tastes are quite eclectic. I like some folk music, some pop music, some rock music. My partner's a classical musician, so I've had a lot of exposure to the standard classical repertoire. And some of that is, I think, for everybody, sometimes a little bit difficult to get at what it is that the composer is trying to say. But we can all, I think, get a sense of the affect and the emotional content of a piece of music relatively easily. Kids do it, don't have to be told that this is sad or happy music. And I think that through that, actually, it's a way of communicating something which, we all know it's not about communicating necessarily through words, but perhaps, again, as I say, if we went at it from the perspective of perhaps the different emotional resonances that there are for, say, somebody like me, where there might be a long, almost blank bit in the middle of a piece of music if there's a lot of high frequencies that I can't hear. So I might be experiencing something which is more about, I don't know, lostness or boredom or isolation or something than might otherwise be the case. But that could still be part of the interpretation of the music.
Yeah, brilliant, Jackie. And I have to ask, have you had any experience with any of the kind of I don't know if tech is quite the right word, but I've come across things like wearables, so vests and that kind of thing, in terms of, I guess, tapping into the vibrations of certain music, I guess mostly amplified music. And on my visit to the UK, that was certainly becoming more common for sort of mainstream arts organisations to have those sorts of gear to hire out to lend out to audience members that wanted it. And just wondered if you had a take on any of that.
Yeah, I've not had a lot of experience of it. I have had some. I think it's a very interesting thing to do, in expanding, in a sense, the perceptions that anybody can bring to, say, a piece of music like that. Again, I'd emphasise, I think it's something that will make some kind of music more accessible to standard people, standard model people, non-disabled people, accessible in a different way. And they might begin also to understand a little bit of what it's like to move through the world in general, using vibration and that sort of thing as part of one's experience. I'm a great fan of using technology to expand the repertoire of the ways that you can experience something. We can have another conversation about, if you're doing that with something like Bach, what would Bach think about it? But maybe another time.
Thanks, Jackie. He's not around to let us know. So yes. Thank you, Jackie. Eugenie, a bunch of things to ask you about as well. I'd love to hear some more about Crip Time. I want to talk to you about empathy, but let's come to Jenny has put a question in the chat here for you that says, how has your practice supported your ability to live with your physical pain? Do others wear your installations to try and understand your pain experience?
First of all, there is no such thing as physical pain. When pain is involved, it's biopsychosocial. So, for instance, if I'm feeling sad or stressed, psychologically, emotionally affected, the so-called physical pain will be a lot worse. Or if I'm interacting with people and somebody happens to be dismissing my experience, it certainly makes my pain worse. And also vice versa, if I'm surrounded by people who makes me feel safe, my pain threshold, but I am able to handle pain way better. Sometimes I don't even feel pain. So there is no such thing as physical pain. I think for people to consider pain as physical experience on its own, that perception itself needs to be changed. There is no such thing. We are a holistic being. So my ability to live with my pain through my practice, how has my practice supported my ability to live with my pain? And whether my installation and making other people to experience pain is for them to understand my pain. No, I put my personal experience out of the equation. So when I design my installation, my haptic design, it's more of an overall experience, the common theme of certain type of pain, for instance, whether it's a neuropathic pain called complex regional pain syndrome that often happens to their limbs. It is that. And my personal lived experience is not included, but it is involved in a sense that whether that pain experience is authentic or not. And I live with persistent pelvic pain. So the second artwork that I've done is about persistent pelvic pain. But again, my own personal experience of my own pain is out of it. It is mainly based on other people who live with persistent pain and grab their common themes and bring that into it. And I've only put my own experience through by making whether, yep, that feels right, no, that doesn't feel right, that kind of thing. It's just an anchor, that's it. Yeah, so when people come and experience something, it is scientifically sound, it is authentic, but almost it's got nothing to do with me. And it is that itself is an important factor.
Eugenie, let's talk a little bit about empathy, because I know this is a word that's come up in your work before, and you know, I guess it'd be interesting to know whether your works, you think, do conjure up empathy for people by that idea of stepping into someone else's shoes. And you know, in the disability community, sometimes we hear about, you know, things like disability awareness training through stimulation activities, like, you know, people going around in a wheelchair who aren't wheelchair users and that kind of thing. So would love you to sort of touch on that idea of empathy and how that comes through your work.
Sure. Empathy and simulation exercise, yes, and no at the same time. Initially, when I started creating artworks using VR and haptic, I didn't really know what I was doing. And I thought, oh yeah, I'm doing simulation art. Oh yeah, I'm doing empathy art. But I had just no idea, basically. But more I think about it, more I feel like I'm not doing that. Although I borrow the idea of simulation exercise, for instance, my intention and outcome go way beyond that. If they were simply about simulation exercise, like, for instance, you know, like some people do, oh yeah, what it feels like to be blind and just walk around a block for half an hour blindfolded or something like that. I mean, if it's just something like that, then I'll be disrespecting people with lived experiences, you know. And so if I'm doing a simulation art involving pain, then it's like the fellow disabled people will be just horribly offended, because there's a risk of me providing a wrong impression that stepping into the shoes of someone living with pain is all about alleged failure to function and their supposedly impaired ability to contribute towards society as non-pain person would. It could almost wrongly steer their focus only on what it feels like to have certain type of pathological pain, but nothing else, because I heavily advocate biopsychosocial holistic experience of pain, the complexity of human experience, which pain happens to be just one of them. So simulation exercise means, like, my work could wrongly represent a gimmicky entertainment like a freak show, or about conjuring charitable feeling towards those living with pain. So what I offer to the interactive audience experience through my work instead is more about drawing out deeper understanding and reflections about fundamental experience of living as a social being. I'm creating opportunities for people to transform the idea from their preconceived notions of pain into reflecting our future. Like, what would our lives like if we all had better understanding of social and emotional influence of pain, and posing questions like, can we all contribute to this as part of society, part of members of society? Do we all share some form of responsibility? Yes, it's a big capital yes. The whole point of my work is to posit an idea that whether there is something that we can all do as a member of society towards better future without leaving behind those living with pain to deal with it on their own. Is pain indeed just an individual experience that should be treated as a single isolated phenomenon that simply has nothing to do with anybody else? Or could it possibly be instead to realize that pain holds a multidimensional, relational, cultural, political, and societal influence that affects far more than just a single isolated entity? I know the answer to that. And hopefully people going through my interactive experience would come to the conclusion. It takes only 10 or up to an hour for them to experience, but I'm hoping the experience itself will transform their attitude permanently. Because persistent pain is a disease in its own right. There's a difference between acute and persistent pain. It takes an entire person, entire society and culture and neuroscience to understand pain because it is so complex. I'm talking about human justice, social studies, anthropology, and philosophy to understand pain. And we are nowhere near close to grasping the whole picture yet because we are so far behind from understanding us, human or animal being. So in a way, it gives me an exciting opportunity to be able to tap into some of these elements. And this is about changing the culture of pain because I'm actively trying to break down the layers of barriers that hinder us from moving away from the old stagnant misconception about what pain is because it can do more harm than good. Like our misconception of pain can seriously do us more harm for people living with pain. And instead, I advocate the accessible methodology as an artist to disseminate the current knowledge of pain for everyone that doesn't discriminate education, gender, age, race, or any other demographic status. And I'm still learning, so my works would always be a work in progress because I just tapped into, learning more about disability studies and theory and things like that. So every time I learn something new, I can translate that into my work to share with my audience.
Thanks, Eugenie. There's so much in that, and great to hear about how it's evolving over time and bringing in new ideas and new theories. The Cryptime's been around for a while, but great to kind of think about how that fits into a pain framework and what that looks like. Time is marching on, so I want to come to Dan, and before we have a sort of general conversation about arts and disability. But Dan, you've had two incredible overseas trips right before COVID, and you got to see some of the leading practice in the world in terms of theatre organisations really innovating around arts and disability. So I wondered if you could share a couple of highlights of which theatre companies were doing great work and what were they doing and what good ideas might we be able to pinch back here in Australia?
That's again, like everyone said up a leg questions, this could be a whole separate discussion in itself, but it's a small discussion now. I would have to say it depends because it was so funny by being in this space, what I was saying just before, by being a disability arts advocate, being someone who identifies as being a disability, as well as being a director. I feel like I was in many different seats, if that makes sense, at the same time. Like one example that I do love, I saw a production at a national theatre in London, which was literally a cast of, I think it was between 16 and 18. So it was a big show. And there was a character at the very top who, and no, it wasn't wicked, but I said it was very much in the vein of, like almost like this godlike character, up the top of a stage. And I thought, no, that's a really clever device. And it was only when the audience took their bales at the end of a show, that it was revealed, for a better word, that he was actually a wheelchair user. And I did like that in the sense that it was showing, obviously the person is a person with a disability, but it was something that we are all discussing here, the whole idea of, almost glorifying from non-disabled people with disabilities. And I thought that was a very important thing to show. And I think it's very interesting on that note that even simple things like with Sam I Am, my most recent show, which does answer the question that I did with Midsummer. And it was funny in the sense that it was two intersectionalities, both the performer and the co-creator and director. It have both been part of a disability community as well as LGBTQI community. But at the same time, when I came up with a concept, I personally felt it was very important to get the support from the deaf community, the deaf hard of hearing community. And yes, I had this idea of what the show was going to be, but I didn't, as someone who has had been on the other side of a coin, I didn't feel I could, in all good consciousness, give my support or, give my what I wanted to do if I didn't have the support. And amazingly, I'm still in contact with all those in the deaf community I was still in contact with. And I thought that was very important that in the UK, what I investigated in that was basically, it gets back to something you said early on when you were discussing where we can go. And it's just, I know it sounds really, really almost simplistic, but it is, and I'm talking about performing arts here, it all comes down to having that conversation. Because for such a long time, us, and I would say us as artists with a disability, have often, and it still does happen, trust me, it does, and I'm sure everyone will agree here, we still have people speaking on our behalf. And yet it is important, obviously, to have representation. I do have great, I don't want to say arguments, but great concerns, but it's a polite way to put it, but when disability is represented by people not of lived experience. Yet at the same time, and this is something that I have taken with me from my research both in the UK and hopefully in New York in January again, and that is basically, I don't exclusively want to direct disability work. And it's so funny, with this whole discussion about diversity, people are suddenly starting to have an understanding, but they are saying, oh, so you just want to do disability work. That's like saying, do I want to just direct LGBTQI work or half Jewish work? And the answer's no.
Limiting, yes.
And then some, a few more diverse is for good measure. No, but I think what I noticed with the UK was that it was literally just so, and obviously they were trying to promote themselves to me, being less colonial from Australia, but, I'm talking the UK here. But I thought it was very interesting that it was just so ingrained in, and we had this discussion with your fellowship too, Morwenna, that it was so ingrained in their, not just knowledge, but discussion. Like, I think it's very interesting that I am in contact at the moment, or have remained in contact with the head of Access at the Globe. And it was so interesting that he basically obviously had worked in a position for some time, but he wanted to know, as someone from a disability, where they can learn from the stuff-ups. And I think that's what I think is very important, that basically it gets beyond just in terms of a consultancy model, because obviously I would love to think, and that's to say bluntly, not necessarily downgrade here, I would like to think in my lifetime we will have an artistic director at a major theatre company in Australia who does identify publicly as having a disability. That would be my hope. If it was me, that'd be great, just put it out there. But, I would like to think at the same time, it wouldn't be the issue. As I think, as important this discussion is tonight, I would hope, and I've said this to anyone who listens, I would hope, and as people are aware, I'm been numerous discussions, and that's one good thing that has come with COVID, to promote my manifesto, so to speak. But, I think I would love to think that basically we wouldn't have to have this discussion in the future. And that would be my hope. Yet at the same time, I do know that of the generation 1 or 2 after me, a lot of issues, I'm talking those who had, let's just say bluntly, at drama schools or art schools, are still facing the same challenges that I had X amount of years ago when I both did my BA in communications and culture studies and my master's in honours. And it's very disheartening that I have both older and younger people contacting me to say to me, and this is, if I can be very blunt about it, Morwenna, saying to me, especially if it's a hidden disability, whatever that means, you know, if they do disclose their disability, either they won't get work or people just won't understand. And I think that's in a culture that promotes us to represent all voices, it's not good enough just to represent all voices. It is to basically have the proverbial, not just have a person on a wheelchair on a stage and say, hey, we've ticked that box, you know, and that does not, to me, it's equivalent like what was just said a moment ago, like I can only talk about my lived experience, and I'm very I stress that all the time when people ask me for my opinions or my views. But at the same time, I think it's very scary that if you do have people with lived experience, they are, I don't want to say used because this is what does happen more often than not, but actually not just have like the proverbial byline in a mission statement, but actually talk the talk. Almost going to say walk the walk, maybe that's a better example, but so apologies if anyone's offended. But you know, I think
no one's walking anywhere right now, Dan.
Exactly. I was going to say we're all stuck. So if we can try to create this kind of not just openness, but realise that I think it's very important. Like even prime example, there's an actress whose name I've suddenly gone blank with, who's in years and years, who's actually a wheelchair user. She's actually been cast in a TV show that's coming up. And I think I said this to Morwenna last week. She's been cast in a while as being a real hard ass, pardon my French, hard as, you know, CEO of a company. To me, that is progress. It's not the poor disabled person, you know, to have pity. It's actually, this is someone given the opportunity can achieve
great things,
you know,
everyday things as well,
and everyday things at the same time. Absolutely.
Dan, again, there's so much in that. I think you brought up a really interesting distinction around arts and disability versus disability arts, and this idea that, of course, artists with disability sometimes want to make work about the lived experience of disability, and sometimes want to make work about any old experience. You know? And so, you know, they're two very separate things. And your point about leadership as well is so important and valid. And it was great to see the Australia Council recently release their Towards Equity report, which, you know, is starting to head towards measuring you know, what our leadership looks like across the arts and cultural sector in terms of diversity. So, you know, really promising to see how that that tracks over time, and that's something, you know, other funding bodies like Arts Council England have been doing, you know, for a really long time. So we're going to have I'm going to have one last question, and then I think we're going to have to kind of say good night and let people get back to the wine and cheese. But I think let's finish by talking about you know, artists with disability, you know, and what makes artists with disability and their work distinctive, if anything, and you know, why is this an area that interests you as individuals, and why is it an area that should interest all of the people listening tonight and all of the arts organisations across the country? What is it about artists with disability that's innovative? Who would like to have a go at that?
Are you throwing that open to everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
I'd like to hear from each of you, if that's okay.
Okay. What interested? I think that is a complicated question, because I think our cultural attitudes to disability is complicated. I think there's still, we've made enormous progress towards understanding that people are varied, towards understanding that having a disability, being disabled, being a person with a disability, however you want to express it, is not just part of being human, but it's a normal part of being human. And it's what happens to everybody if they're lucky enough to live long enough, and for some people earlier on in their lives. So it's not something that we should be, in a sense, trying to sidestep or avoid or be frightened of, but we just need to engage with it and understand this is a part of what happens, and there's some bad aspects to it and there's some very good aspects to it. We've made progress in that direction, as I said. I think underlying that is still an awful lot of fear and anxiety and a desire not to be confronted with something which is difficult or which people find difficult. And you can see that, I think, in some areas of disability arts where there are things which are sort of acceptable and are expected in the mainstream world, if you can say that. And then there are other things which just don't make it into the mainstream arts world because they don't quite fit the box of what either a disabled artist is supposed to be like, or disability arts is supposed to be like, or what the artistic expression of disability experience is supposed to be like. So talking about the grace of a wheelchair user, for example, and the enjoyment you can get out of using a wheelchair very skillfully, that doesn't make it into soap operas, on Australian TV. So I think there is interest there, but we're always going to have to have one foot sort of outside and looking at what that interest is really about. Is it about freak show? Is it about reminding people, gosh, I'm so lucky not to be like that? Is it about telling people I'm so progressive, I'm such a wonderful person? What is this really about? And sometimes I think the thing which will be most useful and revealing and expressive for people with disability is going to be the thing that the audience or the organizer likes the least.
Yeah.
And that's a paradox.
Yeah, I think your what's the word? Your kind of your motivations for the interest is a really good point. Eugenie, Dan, have you got thoughts as well on artists with disability and why everyone should go home after this session and seek out another artist with disability to fall in love with or to think about as a potential collaborator or
well, I actually find any artist create work, it has certain elements of their own lived experience to it, whether they are disabled or yet to be disabled or who are not disabled at all or whatever. It just has a certain element of lived experience, and the art is just like any other human perceptions. It's all subjective, just like pain is subjective and it's all abstract. And the artist has the ability to transform the abstract subjective experience into something tangible that everybody else can relate to one way or the other. And I just find that is a real innovation, that to be able to transform the metaphorical quality using the medium of art into something that can be communicated in so many ways. I mean, some artists, if they're disabled, and they may talk about the negative components of their lived experience, but most of the case they actually don't. Some of them use humor and many different ways to to draw people in. I just find that form of advocacy is something that I just find it just highly interesting. It's just advocacy about human experience.
Beautiful. And Dan, any final thoughts?
I would say, Morwenna, in a sense, it's reiterating what my fellow panelists have had to say, but I think it's very important also how to say this, like as a director, forget a director with a disability, but as a director, at present, I'm actually working on a show that I will be directing for Curtin University, again by Zoom in this time of COVID, fun, you know. But in terms of that, I've been working on what I am actually looking for in my actors. And the first thing I came up with, and this does come with unintentionally my lived experience of disability, I'm very interested in people who come with me with lived life experience. And they can mean anything. They can be from someone, I'm not trying to be flippant when I say this, but someone who may be from a refugee background, someone who actually is from the LGBTQ community, someone who may have a disability, etc., etc., etc. To me, I think I would say to people thinking about employing, and that's the word I wish to say, employ someone with a disability, is that basically, obviously everyone, again, what I said before, everyone's experience is different. But I think if you have someone with a disability, just by one's own existence, so I was trying to not be as heavy on it, but I would say existence, that we have all had lived experience in some form. Like I have memories, my mum tells me as a 3-year-old, I literally had about 10 stuffed monkeys, and 2 of them were suddenly getting a divorce, and I was directing them how they were coping with their divorce. And this is what you get, Mum. No, but bad example, but good example. No, but I think it is that thing is that basically if you have a person with a disability, they actually, by our own factor, have had to see the world, and I don't want to say in a unique way either, but they are literally like, obviously not everyone, and one way or other is, and I'm not myself, I will put my hands up here, totally understanding about disability. And that's someone who actually has a disability. But I think if we can actually literally see what can actually be brought to the party, and it's that whole issue, especially what we talk about, me being a co-chair of artists with a disability committee for the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about should a person without a disability play a person with a disability. I'm in two sides of it, the director's side as well as the disability advocate, in the sense I can see both sides. But I think, just back to what I was saying, if we can actually see that a person with a disability actually has had to, and this is not meant to be a pun, create their own stage, their own world, you know, to at some times, and I'm not going to be all morbid on people, but of survival, you know, at times it has been about survival for me. And basically there have been times I had felt emotionally and physically fearful for my safety, you know, as a person with a disability. And I think if you can try to see that the disability is part of a person and see that part, but also back to what we're saying, like, it's like in any kind of diversity, everyone is different. And I like the whole thing that I quoted in back to, I say, my year 12 HSC English paper on satire. Satire, but let's put in terms of arts here, is about the human condition with all its vices and foibles. And I think who would think that came in use for 20 odd years later. But, you know, if we can think about it like that, what actually makes it, like, I had a friend of mine who saw a production of The Crucible idea. That was not Disabled Crucible, but this friend of mine, and ironically, they identify as a disability themselves, as well as a clinical psychologist. And they said to me, "That was you, Dan." I said, "I'm not John Proctor, I've not committed adultery, and I'm not been executed in a Salem witch hunt, you know, in the 1600s. He said, "But you were in it." Yeah, but you, no, give me time, you know, you know. But I literally did, indirectly or directly, and I'm not trying to be coy when I say that, I did incorporate myself. And yes, the disability, I always say to people, and people without a disability don't get this, it's something I was born with, it's something I'm living with, and guess what, everyone, something I'm going to die with. And as I get older, not just, I don't want to say embrace it, but I do see it as part of me, and it is, and I would say with other artists, it does give me a different lens and way to look things that inverted commas non-disabled person may. But I like to think everyone's got a disability of some form, and at least that's what I've been brought up to believe. So
we're all going to have one at some point, you know, as Jack
exactly,
as
it's been discussed.
Look, thank you so much, my wonderful panel. We have run out of time, but it's been such a pleasure talking to you and hearing about your work and your ideas, and getting some glimpses into what the future is going to look like as well. We've had some really lovely comments and some great questions come through the chat, but it's been just lovely to spend some time with you. And audience out there, thank you for joining us, and do go and seek out the work of our panelists tonight. All incredible, amazing people, and very easy to find online as well, so check them out. And thank you very much to SAMAG and to Accessible Arts for hosting us this evening so that we could have this conversation with you, and make sure it's continued. Go and seek out the work of incredible artists from all different backgrounds, including artists with disability who very selfishly, I think, are making some of the best artistic work on the planet, as I said earlier. And we look forward, you know, I'm sure you'll look forward to your next SAMAG event, which Sophie's chatted to you about, and we hope to see you again in the future too. So good night, everyone, and lovely to spend some time with you.